1619 Project journalist Nikole Hannah-Jones is joining Howard University. The announcement comes following a huge controversy with UNC over tenure. Jones revealed she declined the University of North Carolina's offer before accepting her position at Howard, saying, quote, "It is not my job to heal this university or to ensure that the university leadership lives up to the promises it made to reckon with its legacy of racism and injustice."
Host of the Bad Faith podcast, Briahna Joy Gray, joins us now to discuss. So, Briahna, you recently posted an episode where you delved into critical race theory and the discussion around it. It's fascinating, and everybody should go take a look. What made you want to actually do that episode?
Well, for one, as many people have noted at this point, critical race theory has become an umbrella term used to encompass a lot of different things that are not critical race theory, including basically any kind of tutelage that involves race or teaching a racial history that is more comprehensive than the history that many of us received in school, a history that excluded a lot of aspects of the Black American experience that were less rosy or sanguine to people who have a very traditionalist view of American history. And so Nikole Hannah-Jones' 1619 Project is often referred to as having something to do with critical race theory when it really doesn't. So part of the motivation was to untangle what is going on there. But the main motivation was that I wanted the left to have a conversation about how it should engage in conversations about CRT, regardless of how it's being defined or how that term is being misused. Because my observation is the right is having a much more substantive and ideologically directed project with respect to CRT. They have very specific kind of political goals in mind. And if the left continues to limit itself to a conversation about what CRT is and what CRT isn't, we're missing the ways that it's being politicized and used to advance a kind of politics that I think is really detrimental to working people in America.
So we actually have a clip from Nikole Hannah-Jones talking about this. We can roll that right now.
Look what it took to get tenure. So this was a position that since the 1980s came with tenure. The night chairs are designed for professional journalists who have been working in the field to come into academia. And every other chair before me, who also happened to be white, received that position with tenure.
It had never been denied. No one had ever been denied tenure before.
Exactly. And I went through the tenure process, and I received the unanimous approval of the faculty to be granted tenure. And so to be denied it and to only have that vote occur on the last possible day, at the last possible moment, after threat of legal action, after weeks of protest, after it became a national scandal, it's just not something that I want anymore.
So the White House was also asked about this. Here's what Jen Psaki had to say on the matter.
I have not spoken with the president about the decision on tenure by the institution in North Carolina. I will say that the students at Howard are quite lucky to have her as a professor and in their family. But I think there's no question that there continues to be systemic racism in our country. We see that in a range of sectors, including in some learning institutions.
Okay, so we don't have to litigate all of this. What's interesting to me about the UNC controversy is that absolutely some of it was political. The university got heat, partisan heat, because the 16...
From a donor, right?
From a donor, because the 1619 Project was so politically charged. At the same time, it is sort of grating to see people like Gayle King give an uncritical platform to... And by the way, Nikole Hannah-Jones doesn't need an uncritical platform. She's capable of defending her arguments, perfectly capable of defending her arguments. But that original 1619 Project story had to make substantive corrections, and it was controversial. There was serious criticism of it from historians and bipartisan historians, I should say ideologically diverse historians. So, Briahna, what do you think of this sort of explanation from Nikole Hannah-Jones that I think is being swallowed by a lot of the media, that this is solely a racial issue or a partisan issue? Shouldn't universities also pause and say, maybe we don't want to be rewarding journalists who did have to correct stories, who weren't entirely honest about the corrections made to their stories? Maybe there's a substantive reason to pause this decision in the first place?
Well, Nikole Hannah-Jones, as an individual, is known for some, a fiery way in which she held herself out on social media at times. And I certainly have cross paths with her in my own personal history as a journalist. So there's no love lost there, but I still think that it's pretty clear that the way that her tenure process was handled at UNC was unprecedented. Certainly, she was not the first journalist in the history of journalism to have to correct a mistake, and it's not clear to me that that would be on its own sufficient justification to deny her in the middle of that process. I do wish that this weren't quite the hill that liberals had chosen to die on, because although I think the bulk of the 1619 Project, remember the bulk of which was not penned by Nikole Hannah-Jones, it's an anthology of writings by a number of other authors, a number of other journalists, is quite substantive and useful and historically good. I wish there had been, I think, a more clear and early statement from Nikole Hannah-Jones on that correction. I wish that people hadn't decided to kind of defend it on those grounds for as long as they did. And I think that part of the celebration of Nikole Hannah-Jones in this moment and kind of overcoming the obstruction at UNC by going to Howard glosses over some of the structural concerns, the concerns of the type that the 1619 Project is supposed to be dealing with, right? So that normally most people aren't going to be able to escape to a historically Black institution like Howard University, because Howard University struggles enormously with all kinds of funding problems. And the reason that she was able to go and establish this position there was because of, I believe, $20 million in outside money that has come to support her and what has become, as she puts it, a national cause. So there's a lot of dynamics going on here. I don't think this is necessarily the feel-good story that other people would frame it as being. At the same time, I do think it seems pretty clear that UNC was acting in bad faith in denying her tenure.
Yeah, yes, to your point about Nikole Hannah-Jones having a particular personality on Twitter, he's probably blocked you at some point.
Long ago, I read all about this by opening tweets in incognito windows.
There you go. Yeah, she has not blocked me yet. And to your point, I do think it was unfortunate the way that she and some of her defenders dug in over this particular line, and I think it relates to the kind of celebrity as the intellectual. Because there's she knew that if she dug in on this, she would have a tremendous amount of support, uncritical support, from people, all from the center left to the left, saying that no, you absolutely don't give an inch on this. When in fact, what she ended up doing was a tweak to one line. She had a line that said something like, right, colonists were driven, by the goal of extending slavery to carry out the revolution. She changed it to, some colonists.
It was a part of it, yeah. And that,
right,
it's a pretty big tweak.
We talked yesterday on the show about Lord Dunmore and
I agree. It's a pretty big tweak, but I think you're both making a really good point about how is this really the hill to die on? And Briahna, you recently hosted this debate, as Ryan mentioned, between Arami, the funky academic, and Freddie DeBoer on bad faith to discuss critical race theory, and particularly if the left should defend it or just debate how we define it. Here's a really interesting clip from that interview.
But the absolute obsession with moral hygiene, right? That like you become clean. I have owned my racism. I am, extending my love out to the Black people. What matters in life is your actions, right? Like you are what you do and not what you are. And so you have to be, being an anti-racist means anything, you have to do things that help tear down the material structures that are oppressing Black people.
So, Briahna, can you tell us a little bit more about that clip and how you would have responded to DeBoer in that moment?
Yeah, so what DeBoer was bringing to the conversation was a materialist analysis. I think just before or just after that, he points out that if you walked by, an unhomed Black man on a bench, just because he has love and intersectionality in his heart doesn't mean anything if his behavior doesn't change, and he's not able to materially boost that man's life, and change his circumstances in real manifest ways. And one of my most substantive criticisms of Nikole Hannah-Jones and Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's also taking a position at Howard at the same time, is that class dynamic, that materialist approach is not at all incorporated into their work. So while they do a lot of really important scholarship unpacking America's racial legacy, a lot of it veers into a realm of kind of Afro-pessimism, where you talk endlessly and ad nauseum about what got us here without a real political analysis of how to get us out of this problem, which involves talking about the ways that racism most frequently manifests in these economic ways that strips us of political power and also makes us, one of the most disproportionately uninsured populations in the world, unhomed populations in the world, in the country rather, a population that lost 40% of its net wealth in the housing crisis, and we live in a country where politicians largely get away with statements like Hillary Clinton's classic, "With breaking up the banks cure racism." And that's exactly the kind of statement, that's exactly the kind of analysis you get, that blindness to the extent to which breaking up the banks really would cure a lot of racial inequities in the housing market and beyond, if you were able to integrate a class and race analysis in tandem. And I would point you also to a scholar who has similarly been ostracized and denied tenure, Cornel West, who has not had the same kind of upswell and upswing of support that Nikole Hannah-Jones has enjoyed, but whose politics and whose scholarship, I would argue, does much more to challenge entrenched power systems in the United States. And I don't think it's an accident that someone like him gets a very different treatment and a very different kind of embrace from the community than someone like Nikole Hannah-Jones.
That is a great point. It would be much more difficult for Cornel West to publish on this stuff in the New York Times than it is for Nikole Hannah-Jones.
Well, and Cornel West, one of the premier scholars of his generation, has changed the field in a lot of ways.
Absolutely.
So, Briahna Joy Gray, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Appreciate it. Well, Rachel Bovard joins us next.